And then I love asking British folk how they view the American Revolution. And I was talking to Carl Benjamin, and he's like, mate, that was like 20 years in our 1,000-year history. It's like, we mention it a little bit, but the bigger picture was the wars happening in Europe, not you guys. He's like, I understand for you, it's your entire identity. But for us, it was one small component of an ongoing war that's been happening for some time. And I'm like, that's a really good point.
If you look at these historic crises, most people are apathetic, especially so in wars outside America where most people are just peasants who farm, and then the Lord tells them what to do. And in the English Civil War, which is one of the closest parallels, it was widely known in England that the English were too weak to fight because it had been over a century since England had had a war. What happened then is that in each case, it's small groups of radicals that push for this. The Bolsheviks, the Jacobins, all these groups are like less than 3% of the population. And then they push their interests. And for the right, there's lots of young men who would happily fight for the right because the left has boxed them into a corner. And for the left, both sides would conscript people, because when the government walks up to your door and says your son's going to fight for us, you can't tell them no. And the left would probably arm illegals because that's a demographic they could pull from. They'd hire foreign mercenaries and arm illegals. But this is why I've said in my videos, the right has an 80% chance of winning because the right provides much better incentives for the young men who would fight.
But let's not erase all of this. Let's say that there is it is a fact. The left and the right are at extreme odds in this country. Whether it goes to civil war, who knows? China, Iran, Russia, and in fact, all of BRICS has an incentive for this conflict to happen, which would end the petrodollar, basically destroy the United States, and allow the BRICS reserve currency to take over. In every conflict, let's go to the American Revolution, you had outside financiers. So we say, haha, the French intervened and helped us win our independence. Not really. The French intervened because they were already at war with Britain, and they were like, hey, these guys will help us fight. And so for them, it was like, yeah, let's go to war. And then I love asking British folk how they view the American Revolution. And I was talking to Carl Benjamin, and he's like, mate, that was like 20 years in our 1,000-year history. It's like, we mention it a little bit, but the bigger picture was the wars happening in Europe, not you guys. He's like, I understand for you, it's your entire identity. But for us, it was one small component of an ongoing war that's been happening for some time. And I'm like, that's a really good point. My point here is, let's say there's not a strong enough appetite for a real civil war. Certainly you will see external forces trying to make that happen, as I believe they are now. Why wouldn't they be? And then if it got to the point where there was a pile of tinder, China's going to march right in and try and figure out how to light it up.
Yeah. I find that with who is the force pushing for American unity? Because there's lots of forces pushing for disunity, but I see no single unifying thing in America. There's no one thing all Americans can agree on.
Social Security.
I don't agree on that. I'm going to have to pay that crap and I'll never take it. I don't agree with it either.
We have, it's clearly a joke, but we do have these services that everyone takes part of. I mean, we all like roads. Most people like the military. We all like the safety and security that the American state provides. But I would say the uniting factor would be the state itself, even though the state is up for grabs, is the state has a desire to not go towards disunity and chaos, as we saw in the aftermath of the election last time, where they came down hard on Trump supporters over the overblown fear that somehow they're going to wage a coup or something, even though it was people going around the Capitol taking selfies. They came down that hard because they thought that was a threat, and that could potentially spiral into disunity. And as long as the federal state is extremely strong, which it is, it's much stronger than it was in the 1860s, and it's even much stronger than it was in the 1960s, it's going to keep this together. Now, if that collapsed or was weakened, say, China takes Taiwan and we lost in that war or conflict over it, that could be a weakening of the state, and that could delegitimize it, and then people could be trying to break off, and then something like a civil war happens.
There's no legitimacy in the state. When you poll average Americans, they hate the state. The state is like a 20% approval rate. My question to you is, if a civil war were to happen, what would it look like? What evidence would you need to see in the real world to know that there would be a civil war?
I would have to see two clear sides, and I would have to see, it would have to be some types of battles, at least with people, two different sides fighting over cities. It might not be like a traditional war. It might be more guerrilla guerrilla war or something like we saw in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but it could be something along those regards. I need to see two clear sides.
So let me ask real quick. How many factions were in the Syrian civil war? How many sides were there?
Well, there are several, and there's several factions in the Lebanese civil war. Let me rephrase this. There would have to be sides where people are fighting lethally, using lethal amounts of violence with guns, with traditional military weaponry.
So what you're saying is when a civil war starts, you will agree there's a civil war.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think it'd have to be, even something like the Lebanese civil war, the Syrian civil war, where there's like a dozen different factions, there are battles occurring over cities where there are fights between either two or multiple sides over a city, and that's occurring.
So what evidence do you need to believe we are on track for a civil war?
That there are...
No. That was you saying, if a civil war happens, I will agree there's a civil war. What needs to be happening in a country for you to think, hey, a civil war might happen?
There'd have to be like a bleeding Kansas or something that people are willing to use violence even to get to lay a lethal. It might not be like they're actually fighting for control over a city, but say the left has an insurrection in Seattle and then they fight with police and soldiers there. And maybe it doesn't rise to the way of war, but it shows that this could be replicated.
Wait. But do you think that in the American Civil War, like the citizens of Atlanta were fighting the Georgian government?
No, but I'm saying that...
Why would the left fight themselves in their own city?
I'm saying if they tried to declare the Seattle independent of the United States, that the state would come down hard on them.
Why would they? I'm just trying to clarify this. In Seattle, when they took over the Chaz for a couple of months and murdered people, took over a police station, the government largely agreed with them and let them do it. So yes. It's like saying there's got to be two factions.
I'm just pointing out a hypothetical here.
But hold on, right. So the clarification is, a civil war requires some sides. But why would they be fighting themselves? I don't understand what you're trying to say. Like, why would leftist progressives in a leftist progressive state fight themselves? Wouldn't they want to fight, say, Nebraska or
you
Texas?
Could say, you could go this to say Atlanta, or you could say any other city. I'm just saying that, say, you have leftists in a city that launch an insurrection against the city government or the state, and then the federal, and they're saying we're now an independent city of Atlanta or Seattle. But if the Chaz then tried to take over the city and then say we're independent of the United States government, there would be lethal force to come down.
Hold up. So I'm confused. In the American Civil War in and the American Civil War is not indicative of every other civil war, but I'm just saying, like, in Georgia, they weren't walking out of the houses and going, I hate the Georgian government, I'm going to declare independence from my own state. They were saying the other people over there are bad. So if Seattle, as a group, says we're going to defy federal law and we're going to ignore federal authority, which they've been doing, I don't understand why your prerequisite is that they have to fight themselves. Like, the people in Seattle who took over and shut the police down were largely politically aligned. Wheeler himself came out and joined them in protest in Portland. It was Portland, right? He was with them as they were rioting and protesting and firebombing a federal building.
Yeah.
Like that. Why are they going to fight themselves?
I think you might be a little too focused on the fact that it's Washington and Seattle. I'm just saying this is a theoretical, hypothetical.
Why would any city fight? It's like...
There's a couple of red states where they would fight.
But that's not a civil war. You're saying you're saying like a protest in a city.
I'm not saying that this is a civil war. I'm saying that things like this would need to happen to show like the sides.
So when in a civil war did a city fight its own territory? Like, when in a civil war did like in the Spanish Civil War, you had the Nationalists and the Republicans, and they controlled urban and rural areas. When in that civil war did the Nationalists in their own territory fight themselves?
I'm using the example of just saying that this would happen is that it's creating a political revolution.
Okay, no. We're bumping into a wall. My point is this. Let's pick any jurisdiction. Let's call it the state of statehood. Doesn't need to be anywhere. The people who live in statehood overwhelmingly vote a certain way, have a certain ideology, and believe in it. Why would it need to be that they fight themselves for it to be evidence of a civil war coming? When in a civil war has an isolated jurisdiction of shared ideology decided to declare war on itself?
I was using the example, but here's what I was trying to say. So I'm going to take it back that we're focused on Seattle. Washington's a very blue state.
I'm washing that of anything. I'm saying why would any faction fight itself before a civil war is to begin?
They would be different factions. That's what I was arguing. Because let's say that it's left rising up against the federal government, and so it could be anywhere in this country. I'm just pointing out that this is the left and saying that the federal government, maybe the state of Washington decides to go along with the left, or maybe they decide to go with the federal government. I'm just pointing out that example is that if it's one locality that rises up against the federal government for either the right or the left, the sides that I would say, there could be multiple other sides being formed afterwards, but they're rising up against the federal government. It'd be like in the Syrian Civil War, where they're rising up against the government, and then many other factions began to form.
Like in the Pacific Northwest, when I think it was something like 110 days, where far leftists were throwing explosives at the federal building surrounding it, and the building was shut down. Federal authorities were trapped inside. Trump called in numerous different federal law enforcement, but the government of Portland, the local government, sided with the far left extremists who were firebombing a building.
Yeah, and that would be a sign that the local government is then siding with the left, that escalated past that into that they're trying to take over the entirety of Portland, and then Portland's city government is like, oh, we're siding with them. They would have to choose whether they side with the left. But I want to put this out that I don't think this is likely. I'm just saying it's a possible scenario.
So do you believe that if an ideological faction in a city started trying to take over or destroy a federal building in defiance of federal authority and fought with federal authorities and the state sided with them, would that be a civil war?
No, but it could be a sign of a possible civil war that arises that's happening elsewhere, and then that begins to escalate into they're trying to take over the city.
You think that would...
It would have to be taking over like Chaz in this incident. If there's like tons of Chaz's taking over and then Chaz tries to expand to take over the city, I would say that that's a warning sign of something that could happen with a civil war.
So if a large group of, say, leftists had an autonomous zone that they controlled, like the size of Chaz, and people had already been killed, but if Chaz then started to expand, that makes you think maybe a civil war could happen.
Maybe if they're trying to take over the city and that they have many, many allies across the country and that there's a sizable part of the population that agrees with them. People were misled into thinking these are just peaceful protesters, but if you ask American people and they're like, do you support the left-wing autonomous or whatever they want to call themselves taking over the entire state of Washington and declaring themselves independent of the United States government, and then like 20-30% of the population is like yes, then you have a chance of that there's some type of secession or civil war happening. But I don't believe this is happening. And even with Chaz, that's a disturbing element that we could see more of. But it's almost like the no-go zones that you see in Europe with the, Islamic neighborhoods just sprouting up and it's being ruled effectively by Sharia law. Instead, we have leftist no-go zones.
Well, they're very different. So
you could see something of that sort.
I've gone to some of these areas. I went to Sweden. I think I was in, where was I? Belgium. I went to Europe. I went to France. I went to Germany. And these no-go zones are nothing like what we saw with Chaz Chop. Chaz, they murdered people. They unloaded. There was one story where they unloaded for about 10 minutes, hundreds of rounds into a white SUV, just because it was a violation of their territory. And they said they assumed it was, they were told it was white supremacists.
I mean, there are gang-run territories where they kill a lot of people in America.
Not like that. I'm from Chicago, and I can tell you what Chicago's like. So having a conversation, well, actually, I don't want to put anybody in danger.
Are you saying that in gang-run territories, if a rival gang goes in there, that they won't shoot up the vehicle?
So you're saying that a regular person walking into the Chaz is a rival gang?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there are territories, even in America, which
let me tell you that even in Chicago, the idea that there would be a sectioned off area with security guards, barriers, and a police station that was completely taken over, and that men with rifles would unload for 10 minutes, hundreds of rounds into SUVs, and there were other people who were murdered in Chicago, that's unheard of. Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.